The effect is that although on paper the tax rate is 40%, you're effectively paying a 60% tax rate.
The Doctors' Vote wing of the BMA have basically taken over. They are incredibly radical. The space economy is predicted to get up to about $1.8 trillion by, I think, it's 2035. So huge amounts of money, but also huge amounts of technological advancements. Hello and welcome to the IEA podcast. My name is Reem Ibrahim and I'm the Communications Manager at Linda Whetstone Scholar here at the Institute of Economic Affairs. Today I am delighted to be joined by Tom Clougherty, the IEA's Executive Director, and Kristian Niemietz, the IEA's Editorial Director. Today we are going to be discussing family taxes, junior doctors potentially going on strike, and space. Tom, would you like to kick us off with the first topic?
Which is family taxation, not space. Sorry to break that to people. We'll come to that in a bit. Yes, so this week, Nigel Farage, leader of Reform, announced that his party, if they were in government, would effectively make the personal allowance transferable between married couples. Now, he framed this as a way to try and boost the birth rate. Possibly it would have some impact at the margin, but I don't think it would have a huge effect. And I think the evidence from around the world suggests that, yes, you can encourage people to have more children with fiscal incentives, but they need to be massive. And this wouldn't be quite on the scale, I think, that would be necessary. Leaving that aside, though, I think this is a sensible tax policy because you have a situation in the UK at the moment where, because we have solely individual taxation, even though the welfare state mostly works on a household basis for tax, you're always assessed as an individual. What that means is that a household or a couple with the same income, two households with the same overall income, can pay wildly different amounts of tax depending on how that income is distributed between the partners. So if it's split 50-50, as a rule, they will pay a lot less tax because they're both benefiting from the full personal allowance. Maybe they're both paying only the basic rate of income tax. Now, if all of the income is being earned by one of the partners, only one person tax allowance applies, and probably their income is going to, cross over into higher rates of tax. So you end up paying more overall. It wasn't ever really intended to be this way. So it's a kind of weird historical quirk that when Nigel Lawson announced independent taxation in 1988, rather. Now, before that, by the way, a married woman's income was just treated as her husband's income for tax purposes. So that was pretty bad. And so introducing independent taxation was definitely a good thing, both as a rationalization of the tax system, and also so that women could have like some kind of independence and they didn't have to tell their husband all of their earnings and stuff if they didn't want to. But I think Lawson always intended to accompany this by making the personal allowance transferable between married couples. So if, say, one partner was staying home to look after children for a while, the other one could benefit from their tax allowance. That never happened, or at least it never happened to the extent that it was intended to happen. There was a kind of watered-down form, which was then abolished by Gordon Brown, and David Cameron brought something back, which, the maximum benefit is about £250 a year. So actually most people who are eligible don't even bother trying to claim it. So the UK, right, if you look at, we often talk about how high are taxes in the UK. The tax burden overall is high by historical standards, very high. But then on the other hand, people will point to, the tax wedge on an average worker and say, compared with a lot of other countries, the UK is not taxed too badly. Maybe marginal tax rates at the top end are too high. Maybe we've got a poorly structured tax system. But if you're an average earner, you're not being taxed that heavily compared with a lot of other countries. That's true if you're talking about a single worker without a family. If you compare households with children, particularly if you were to compare a single earner household with children on an overall kind of average wage, they will be paying more tax in the UK than they would in France, than they would in Germany, definitely than they would in the US, and actually more than they would in the average OECD country. So I think, when we talk about how high taxes are or not, you've got to look at them from different perspectives. And so people's experience of the tax system, the real impact it has on them, can be very different depending on precisely the way these things break down. Look, one other thing I'll just mention here is that I think in an ideal world, you wouldn't need things like transferable tax allowances because you just have, in my view, a flat tax system. So it wouldn't really matter how the income was distributed. It would all just be taxed at the same rate. As soon as you have a progressive tax system, I think that you do need these kind of offsetting measures. And we always talk about doing it through transferable tax allowances in the UK. If you look at Germany, they have a system called income splitting, where basically if there are two of you, you combine the income and then you halve it and you're both taxed as individuals. Actually, that might be easier to implement in the UK than transferable allowances, albeit it would be more expensive in revenue terms. And so in France, they have a really interesting system as well called the quotient familial, where basically you get, in effect, a point for each member of the household. In fact, it's 1 point for each adult, half a point for the first two dependent children, and then a full point for each subsequent dependent child. You apply that quotient to your overall tax liability, and it reduces it quite significantly depending on the size of your household. Again, this is quite an interesting way of doing things. And I think there's always a little bit of parochialism in most areas of policy, and particularly in tax. We just take it for granted that everyone is taxed as an individual, even though, as I say, the welfare state works in a completely different way. But if you look at most other comparable countries, there is some recognition of a household basis there. And that's something I think would be sensible to adopt in the UK. I don't think, by the way, this is about trying to turn back the clock and always have one parent staying at home looking after the children. I don't think it's really even about trying to boost the birth rate or anything as reform wants. I think this is about kind of basic fairness and kind of equity within the tax system.
It's really interesting. Is the current system particularly damaging for couples that have larger varieties in their income?
Yeah, very much so. So the disparity, I haven't got the most up-to-date figures to hand because the Conservatives, as they were leaving government, kind of changed what's called the child benefit tax charge, which is where you claw back child benefit as soon as one of the parents earns over well, it was once they earned over the higher rate threshold or over 50,000. Now it's over 60,000 and they withdraw it more slowly. So that's got a little bit better. But yes, there are these pinch points where if one of you falls into them, you can end up paying really high rates of tax. Whereas if you had the same amount of income, but it was split evenly and you didn't fall into that tax trap, you'd be much better off. I mean, the really classic one is that you could have two people each earning £99,000 and getting like free government-funded childcare for their under 5 children, right? And if one person earned 101,000 and then their partner didn't work or didn't have an income, they'd have to pay for all of the childcare out of pocket in that situation. And that just seems crazy. And I mean, that's why
it's a huge cliff edge.
If you go over that 100 grand cliff edge and you have young children, you may need to earn like an extra 40,000 or something before you're better off. So I think you get a huge amount of like people shoveling money into their pensions and stuff at that point, or just reducing their hours, all kinds of things. This ultimately is the point. You don't want people changing their economic behaviour based on the tax system. You want it to try and be as neutral as possible.
It's incredibly damaging to behaviour, especially for those particularly working people. I think the cliff edge at £100,000 is so fascinating because it is so damaging to those families that do have children, but also the fact that you basically have to earn another £50,000, almost £50,000, in order for you to reap back those benefits is insane. Kristian, what are your thoughts on reform's potential policy?
Well, I'm not convinced by reform's tax proposals overall because, what they're doing is Farage specifically said, no, this is not like the mini budget because, yes, I'm announcing big tax cuts, but I'm also announcing spending cuts. And okay, technically true. It's just that the tax cuts, the revenue loss of those is certain, whereas all the spending cut announcements are at the very least contested and nobody quite knows how much is that going to be. It's quite speculative. And in that sense, it very much is like the mini budget again. But specifically when it comes to the transferable tax allowances, there I think they have a point. And I've written about transferable tax allowances as well within the household in the past. Normally, that is an argument which is made by people from the conservative end of the political spectrum because they think the tax system should specifically promote household formation and possibly even a higher birth rate. I've written about it from a very different perspective, even though ending up largely in the same place. But my argument was a very different one. I think the tax system should be completely neutral with regard to how two partners divide the workload between them. But the current system doesn't do that for the reasons that you've outlined. And transferable household allowances would go quite some way in that direction, that it would just be, well, at the moment, if one partner is in work, the other one isn't, then the second one loses all that tax allowance that they could have had, and they just can't make any use of it. It's just a pure loss. Whereas if you made at least that allowance transferable, that would be a big step towards, at least in that regard, treating the household as an economic unit for tax purposes, which, of course, we can argue about the principle. Should you assess should the tax system treat everybody as an individual, or should it take the household as an economic unit? But whichever it is, you have to be consistent. And what we have at the moment is that the tax system only deals with individuals, the benefit system only with households, and that leads to a lot of anomalies. So if somebody who works and pays taxes moves in with somebody who receives universal credit, then that second person's universal credit entitlement comes to an end, because the benefit office will then say, well, okay, you're part of a household now, that your partner's income is also now your income. You don't need universal credit anymore. But by the same token, that person cannot bring their tax allowance, which they're not making use of, into that household. And in that way, it's a system which clearly favors dual earner households, and it's very much not neutral with regard to how people behave in economic terms.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting, particularly on that point. Could you explain a little bit about how tax allowances actually work in practice, and what what transferring it could look like?
Yeah, so I mean, I think the basic thing, we get about 12,500. The first 12,500 that anyone earns is free from income tax, effectively, and then there's another, about 37,500 on top of that, which takes you just into the 50s, which is taxed at the basic rate, 20p. You go into the 40p rate above that, so paying 40% marginal rate up to 100,000. Once you get to 100,000 in the UK, the personal allowance is withdrawn. So for every £2 you earn over 100,000, you lose £1 of your personal allowance. This is an insane way to operate the tax system, but nevertheless, someone thought it was a good idea. The effect is that although on paper the tax rate is 40%, you're effectively paying a 60% tax rate up to, about 125,000 or so. And then you go into what they call the additional rate, which is 45 pence marginal rate thereafter. Now, of course, you've got national insurance to add on top of that. Won't bother going through all those numbers now. But what this would mean is that, the most basic version of this is that if you're a married couple and one of you doesn't earn over the personal allowance amount, so someone is earning less than 12,500 a year, whatever portion of unused personal allowance is left over can simply be transferred to the spouse. So that could be the whole personal allowance. So then the other person would get 26,000 tax-free before they start paying the basic rate, and so on. That would be the most basic way to do it. Now, it could be based on marriage. It could just be based on cohabitation. It could just be for people with dependent children at home. That would reduce the cost, and there would be kind of a certain logic to that if you're just trying to target scarce resources in the most effective way. But there are a variety of different ways of achieving the same thing. I mean, one of the interesting questions with this would be, okay, you allow them to transfer the personal allowance. Does that then shift the point at which the higher rate thresholds and everything kick in? Do you then get 25,000 and then you get the full basic rate limit, which would then move the higher rate threshold for this person up into the mid 60s or something, and so on? Normally, they try to structure these things, at least the proposals for these things, so that doesn't happen. And so that effectively you get some kind of tax deduction, but you still, once you earn over 50,000. So it doesn't actually, simply having a transferable personal allowance, as it's normally discussed in British public debate, doesn't achieve proper equity if you have someone who is still a higher rate taxpayer. But you can go further. You can do different things. You can, as I suggest, adopt something like the German or the French model, or you can have a whole different set of allowances and thresholds, as they do in America, depending on your household status when you file for taxes. So there are a lot of ways of doing this. Now, it's worth saying it's not necessarily cheap to do this. It was 2023 when I last had any modelling done on this. So these figures, the numbers would probably be slightly higher now, but just as a guide, making the personal allowance fully transferable between married couples in the UK would cost about 6 billion. If you restricted it to married couples with a child under 18 at home, that would halve the cost, or maybe a little less than halve it. So let's say 3 to 4 billion. Now, obviously, if you just say all cohabiting couples, that will be a lot more. If you went for the German or the French model, it would be more expensive still. So it does always raise the question. This may be a desirable change to make to the tax system. I think it definitely is a desirable change to make to the tax system. However, unless you're going to offset it with spending cuts, which I would obviously prefer, you have to think about what else changes in the tax system as a consequence. And I'm not necessarily comfortable with saying, well, we're going to make the tax system lighter on families, good, but we're going to charge single people more. That doesn't really seem fair either, especially given the relative consumption of public services and everything. So I think there are some tricky issues to iron out. But if you look at this in isolation as a policy proposal, it seems to be definitely a step in the right direction.
Yeah, another problem with the current system is that we have a lot of fiscal churn going on. So there are millions of households with children, especially families, where they pay a lot of tax, and at the same time they get a lot of child tax credit, child benefit, and so forth. And it would make a lot more sense to have a system where you either pay taxes or you receive benefits. And if you want to do that, if you want to eliminate this unnecessary turnover, that overlap between the taxpayers and the benefit recipients, then both the tax system and the benefit system would have to deal with the same unit of account, and that would have to be the household. And then you have to basically merge the two rather than have a tax system on the one hand, a benefit system on the other hand. You have to have an integrated tax benefit system, and they both have to deal with the same unit, the same economic unit, which then has to be the household.
Yeah.
I think it's definitely an interesting debate, and certainly one that will continue if reform push ahead with this kind of policy. Let's move on to the next topic. We've got junior doctors' potential strikes, although now they want to be called resident doctors. So to respect them, I will call them resident doctors. It's really interesting, actually. The ballot opened on Monday this week, and they were discussing whether or not they should they opened up a bit later than Monday, but they were discussing whether or not they should strike, I think, starting from July, because they are asking for a 29% pay increase. Now, over the last 2 years, they already received a 22% pay increase. What they are claiming is that they've received a real terms pay cut since 2008. Now, they are using CPI to calculate this, which has largely been discredited when thinking about pay increases and what somebody is, quote unquote, worth. But of course, public sector pay has to be seen in the context of public sector spending. You cannot divorce that. And anytime there are increases in spending across the board, that of course has to compete with other budgets across government. And so I think what is interesting is the conversation seems to be about doctors earning a lot more, but not where that money is going to come from. And of course, we all know that the government are already under huge amounts of constraint at the moment, and there really is no more money for that to be spent. What's interesting, I think, is the debate. At least the debates I've seen around this have actually, I think the Overton window sort of shifted on the NHS as a whole. And it's much more politically possible to then say, well, if what you are saying is you want to earn as much as doctors in social health insurance systems, how about we transition the NHS to a social health insurance model? And I was on Good Morning Britain this week discussing this with a junior doctor, and they didn't seem abhorred by the idea. They actually were like, well, we could reform the system in that way. But crucially, public sector workers, their salary is not decided by things like supply and demand. It's not a labour market. And when your only employer is the state-dictated National Health Service and a government bureaucrat decides what your salary is, that causes a whole host of problems, and it means it's impossible to really decide what that particular person is worth. So I think that the conversation should be about what a labour market in medical places could look like. We've got to uncap medical school places and really allow for that kind of migration to occur, so that we can really see, okay, if this is what the demand is for this number of people, then this is what their salary could be, and there could be that demand for it. The BMA as a whole, though, I think are particularly pernicious with this kind of argument, and the Doctors' Vote wing of the BMA have basically taken over. They are incredibly radical. It's quite interesting. Chris Snowden, our colleague, wrote about the fact that they are opposed to physician associates. So it's effectively people that are slightly less qualified than a nurse, but they are able to do a lot of things that GPs currently do that is probably a waste of their time. People that basically have loads of ailments that could be solved with some paracetamol, and it's wasting a professional medical doctor's time that earns a lot more. But they're opposed to that. They're opposed. They talk about how overstretched doctors are, and yet when a solution comes about, they don't like it because they have to protect their own interests.
Well, and I think there are complaints from junior doctors, and I haven't looked into this, so I don't know how true they are, that some of these physician associates are actually earning more than them despite having much lower levels of qualification and everything. So, I mean, this is what competition looks like, but I can understand why they get a little bit upset. I think you've hit on all the key themes there already, Reem, but a couple of things that are important to note. The first one is when they say we're being paid less in real terms than we were in 2008. Of course, it's not the same doctors who are being paid less. And this is something which is true across public sector pay debates. They're always talking about how a particular person in a particular position at a particular point in time is earning less. And that's true. But actually, the people who used to be earning whatever it was in 2008 have moved up through the ranks and are earning more now, often quite generously so, because in many cases in the public sector, pay just depends on time served rather than any kind of real market forces and stuff. And that, of course, is the other crucial point. How much would a junior or resident doctor be worth in a free market? What is their market value? We have no real way of knowing in the UK because this is a completely government-dominated scheme. My guess is that if we had a more free market healthcare system, a lot of junior doctors would earn a lot more. Now, they would also face a lot more competition, I think, from things like physicians' associates or pharmacists or whatever it is.
Or AI doctors.
Or indeed, from more doctors as well, if you uncap medical school places and so on, although then you have to deal with the financing issue there too. But these are questions we can think about them, we can speculate, but we can't really say for sure what would happen because we don't have a free market or anything approaching a free market in healthcare. And I think that's a big issue. There's one other thing that I think is worth just mentioning here, and maybe this is more of a kind of psychological point than it is a practical one. But I was looking at what the sort of starting rate of pay is for resident doctors in the UK. It was sort of 39,000, fine. But then I was like, well, what is the minimum wage now for someone working the same amount of hours? And that's probably like 25,000 or something. So, as a doctor with years of training and obviously probably quite an intense job if you're working in a hospital and everything else, you're earning 1.5 times the minimum wage. Now, I can understand why people are going to look at that and say, this is crazy. But this is a general theme across the British economy because we've had very sluggish wage growth for most people, for average earners. But at the same time, we've had massive increases in the minimum wage. You've got this wage compression at the lower end of the spectrum. And I think that is increasingly just going to drive a lot more resentment because people aren't going to feel that they are getting any benefit from investment in their own human capital if the lowest paid job there is right there just behind them.
I think that's true. And I think that what we have seen this week is the polling shows that public support for these strikes are significantly less than they were previously. A lot of it was talking about the fact that the last time we saw a round of strikes from doctors, about 1.5 million appointments, procedures were cancelled. The real number is probably a lot higher than that. But people do feel the effects of these kind of strikes. And a lot of the British public tend to be quite sympathetic towards NHS workers, and something has shifted. I think people are slightly more aware of the fact that the National Health Service as a whole is, not this sacred cow that is so much better than other European systems. I mean, Kristian, this is something you've written about for years. Do you sense that shift in the Overton window, and do you think this is reflected in the polling, around what junior doctors might or might not do?
Well, there's a general shift in the Overton window that it's become harder to shock on this issue. In previous years, I didn't have to try harder. Well, yeah, I've just had to make a fairly standard argument about different ways of organizing healthcare, and you would get a Twitter storm every time, even though what I was saying was fairly harmless and wouldn't have raised an eyebrow in any other European country, probably. That's no longer the case. So in that sense, there is a shift in the Overton window. Whether it specifically affects this announced strike, I don't know. It could be that there's a different dynamic at work, which is, the textbook model, the health economics textbook would always say that if you have an NHS type system, one theoretical advantage of it is that it is a monopsony, demand side monopoly. It has a lot of market power, and it can use that to keep prices and wages down. It can tell either a drug manufacturer or a doctor's union, look, this is what we offer, take it or leave it. If you don't like that, emigrate. It is in that position, which healthcare providers in other systems wouldn't have that power. They wouldn't be able to do that. And for that reason, other things equal, you would expect doctors, healthcare professionals in an NHS type system to be paid less than in a different healthcare system. But then there's the countervailing force here that when you get confrontations between the government and, whether it's the BMA or the Royal College of Nursing, some organization that's seen to represent healthcare workers, with the whole psychology around the NHS, the way it works here is that these groups are seen as the true representatives of the NHS. So in the past, at least, the sacred status of the NHS has worked in favor of these groups. And that's why doctors in Britain are actually quite well paid by relative to average incomes, and compared to, if you express doctor salary as a multiple of the median, then British doctors are not badly paid by international standards. They're not. I think American doctors are the best paid in the world, but British doctors are not in a terrible place. So that textbook model doesn't seem to be true. So at least it doesn't seem to translate into that finding that you get lower prices and wages here. And it is because of that dynamic that when you have a confrontation between healthcare workers and the government, the healthcare workers will be in a stronger position, especially if they are able to turn this into, as they were under the Tory government, if they framed this as, if they manage to say, look, this isn't about our pay. Oh no, we're trying to save the NHS. And if you have a government that isn't trusted on the NHS, then the doctors are in a stronger position.
Argument to make. It is so interesting that the campaigns that they have ran with have been about the fact that this is all the doctor's pay is all somehow about improving patient care, which is very interesting. I do think what this does reveal, though, and I think this is the case with a lot of public sector strikes, is just the nature of the way a labour market works in the private sector. If you're in the private sector, even if there's a competitive healthcare system, if you don't like your job or your working conditions, you can quite easily move to another employer. In the National Health Service, you don't have that choice. And so withdrawing your labour is quite literally the only option that you have as a negotiating tactic. And really what it is they're trying to put pressure on the public to create all of this outrage so that the government move their hand.
Well, maybe this is the natural corollary of what Kristian said about the NHS having kind of monopsony purchasing power, that you have a national contract for doctors that applies across the country in different hospitals and different regions and everything else. I mean, to me, that just doesn't make any sense, really. You should localize it. It should probably be right down to the level of individual hospitals to attract the staff they want and pay them accordingly. And then in such a system, if people are unhappy, sure, there will still be overall resource constraints, so options may nonetheless be limited. But people will be able to say, well, I'm not liking it here. I'll go and apply for a job at a different hospital or in a different county that has a different policy. We don't have that with a national one-size-fits-all system. And I suppose this may just be an issue with nationalised industries in general, that on the one hand, yes, we might be able to drive costs down, although it doesn't always feel like it, does it? But at the same time, the downside is if the staff get fed up with it, striking is their main avenue of redress. And, that's not a healthy kind of situation to be in at all. It's, I guess in a way, it's a system that just isn't very robust. It's prone to break down.
What I would add is that even within the system we have, we could move a lot closer to having an actual medical labor market. Because if you just treated every healthcare provider, every unit within the NHS as an employer in its own right and got rid of national pay scales, you could have something close to a labor market, a medical labor market, even within the system we have. And because right now, we also have the problem with, when we've had this for years, that some medical professions are ridiculously oversubscribed. Lots of people want to work in particular fields within medicine, while others have persistent shortages. If we had a medical labor market, that would just be, salaries would reflect that, would respond, and would eliminate the shortages and the surpluses. And right now, the system is wholly reliant on politicians figuring this out and changing the national pay scales in some way, rather than just have individual actors within the system responding to supply and demand. So ideally, if we had a market-based healthcare system, then that would just be an automatic feature. A labor market, a free labor market for medical professions would just be a natural corollary of that system. But even within a national health service, you don't have to do things in this way. There were reforms on the way in the Blair years of giving individual healthcare providers, individual NHS units, greater autonomy, treating them as as semi-independent actors, and you could absolutely extend that to the labor market. That was always the missing part in the Blair reforms.
I think Julian Legrand at LSE has written quite a bit about that, and the way in which it could work within the public sector if you take Blair's reforms and actually go a bit further. I think the real takeaways from the junior doctors' potential strikes is that their claim that they've had a 30% pay cut since 2008 in real terms is just basically false. I mean, it's using CPI.
But then the government says they've had a 30% pay increase in the last 3 years. So without assessing these numbers,
Yeah, it's a lot of these numbers are, they're using different measurements effectively, using CPI in that way.
In a way, it's the wrong debate. I know we get every time there is a threat of a strike within the health service, we get these media requests. Surely you guys are against it. We need an anti-voice. We need an anti-doctor's voice that they all think our position is going to be pay them nothing or pay them peanuts. Where I normally turn down these requests because if they know that that's just not what my position is going to be. I'm going to say that we just have the wrong system to work these things out. To ask me how much should a resident doctor earn, how much should a nurse earn, is like asking me how much should an English teacher earn. I don't know. Supply and demand. Try to work it out.
Yes.
Can I ask, are they basing it on RPI rather than CPI? Because RPI tends to be the higher measure of inflation, which is generally not used anymore. So that would inflate the figure.
I think it's CPI, but I could be wrong. We can double check that. Okay, maybe I think the real takeaway there is that we don't know what a doctor or a nurse or indeed any public sector worker should earn because their pay is not being decided by supply and demand. Kristian, talk to us about space.
Well, yes, we've had this paper out this week on the space economy. It's a literature review on pretty much every book I think that's been written about the space economy, and most of them are from the last 2 or 3 years, so it's a very new field of research. I didn't know anything about this before, so my assumption was that the space economy, that it's a bit like, say, the Arctic economy. You have a few research stations, mostly by the Norwegian government, and the Arctic, and that's it, but there's no economy as such. And I thought the same was true of outer space. It's not at all. The space economy is a big thing already. Especially satellite manufacturing and launching them. And it's becoming an even bigger thing. It's a fast-growing industry, and it's mostly nowadays driven by the private sector. So most of the space economy nowadays is private. So there was a time when almost everything that happened in outer space was government funded. That was in the 50s, 60s, 70s. But that was actually a bit of an anomaly. You had space exploration before then was largely private. It's just that before then, space exploration didn't mean space flight or anything. It just meant observatories and exploration in the sense of collecting data and trying to figure out how space works. And that was largely private sector driven. Then you had this interim period when most outer space activity was government activity, and it's now moved back to a private sector driven economy or sector of the economy, where once you had private sector actors back in the game, that did lead to cost reductions because while it was in the decades when it was all government-led, there was no incentive to cut costs. You had an approach called the cost plus contract, where you tell whoever you're contracting with, look, we're going to reimburse your costs plus X. And then, of course, there's zero incentive to cut costs.
Yeah.
And it was only when that changed, when you had privately funded space activities, that there was suddenly an incentive for what was called a process innovation, where you could say the first satellites, that was a product innovation, where suddenly you could do things that were not technologically possible before. What happened then later was the process innovation, doing that at a fraction of the cost, and that's what has driven the growth of the private space economy. And in that way, even though it is a new field of research, if you look at it, you quickly find familiar themes. So you will find a few themes that will be definitely for IEA readers, that will look familiar, that you need a market discovery process, even in outer space.
It's so fascinating, actually, thinking about the fact that so many of these companies have really revolutionized the space economy and the technology that already exists. I mean, SpaceX, Elon Musk's company, has created huge numbers of satellite dishes. Things like Starlink has literally revolutionized the way that we connect with people, especially in the developing world where access to the internet is so much more difficult. I've written a piece which will go out on the IEA Substack on the Falkland Islands and their telecommunications monopoly, and how individuals have actually been able to use things like Starlink in order to override the telecoms monopoly that was created by the state. So it is really revolutionizing the way in which people are able to access the internet, and even just thinking about space exploration as a whole. Although I was really surprised when looking at this paper how large the private sector's involvement is. I mean, the government basically about 10%, 9-10% of total spending, and the space economy is predicted to get up to about $1.8 trillion by, I think, it's 2035. So huge amounts of money, but also huge amounts of technological advancements that, again, will not just the discovery process in so many ways, as you said, Kristian, it's the way in which we're able to discover new technological advancements and innovate, and that's only really possible in this way. But crucially, historically, space exploration has always been dominated by the private sector. It's only really around the Cold War that the government and governments across the world ended up spending so much more on space exploration. But historically, that's not been the case. And really what we've now seen is a return to that. And we should really embrace that competition.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting. It's possibly a classic example of public spending crowding out private investment, actually. But maybe we would have advanced further in space exploration had the government not dominated the field so much for so long. I mean, look, this comes as an interesting time because I think this week as well, Elon Musk has left the White House, or he's left Doge, and he's gone back to his private businesses, SpaceX among them. And so, it does seem like possibly he's failed to revolutionize the federal government. Maybe Doge, they say they've saved about 175 billion. It's not nothing. It's a relatively small amount in the overall context of US federal spending. And then, of course, I think this was a sort of a Twitter spat this week, wasn't it? That Trump's big, beautiful tax bill is going to increase the deficit by many multiples of that amount anyway. So it all seemed...
impose loads of taxes on your own people. This is what happens.
Well, okay, so cutting some taxes, raising the tariffs, lots of spending, everything else. Now, look, I mean, I think it's very disappointing that someone with Elon Musk's incredible past in business was not able, it seems, to bring that to bear in politics and make a real difference. There were probably mistakes in the way the whole thing was approached. And they do say that, yes, people are going to be, from Doge, seeded throughout the federal government going forward. So maybe there will be a long run impact. But here's the thing, to get back to the actual topic. As much as I'm disappointed by that failure in government, maybe it's better for the world if his energies are focused on things like space exploration, right? Because that could be huge. I mean, these numbers about how much this particular sector of the economy will be worth in so many years are always pretty much made up and pulled out of thin air. But it does seem like, there is a huge amount of potential growth there, and it's very exciting, and it's being driven by the private sector. And I think that's great. And I think the one thing that I really do like about it is that I think whatever the flaws of the kind of big government-led approach to space exploration in the kind of mid-century period, it did kind of inspire people, and it gave people a sense of optimism about progress and the future, and a sense that we weren't a society in decline, but one that was, breaking new frontiers. And when that kind of all went into decline, and before the private sector started to pick things up, I'm not saying that's in any way responsible for our societal malaise, but it coincided, I think, with people becoming a lot less excited about the future, a lot less keen on change and progress. And maybe if we see these great feats of human ingenuity occurring, people will once again start to think, you know what, actually, this is not as good as it gets. There are so many more things that we can do and achieve and explore.
This is exactly why I am an optimist, despite Kristian's criticisms of that. Well,
That's when it comes to space, even I'm a bit of an optimist.
Well, it's the thing, right? There are innovators, and I think it's the kind of thing that people like Israel Kirzner and Ludwig von Mises wrote about, these entrepreneurs that discover resources and create value, and they're able to innovate in that way because they're incentivized to. And I really do feel as though situations like this, where we're able to talk about things like the space economy and the technological advancements that could occur, that would literally, Starlink is just such a brilliant example of that, where it's in so many ways taken, really alleviated poverty in one metric at least. The fact that people are able to connect with each other so much more easily at such a low cost in comparison to existing technologies, but also the fact that things like space tourism and lunar exploration are able to, even be discussed as a possibility, I think is so exciting. And fundamentally, I believe in freedom because I believe in people. I think that people like Elon Musk are able to do that, and there is so much value that these people can obtain, and they're able to do that despite the hugely heavy-handed nature of government.
And it has economic policy implications as well, or will at least in the future. So if we think about asteroid mining, it's technically, I think, at the margins already possible, but not in a way to make that an economic sector in its own right. But that could happen in the not too distant future. And then we will have to think about who can own resources that are floating around in space. At the moment, it's all, yes, you would have to have something like an enclosure act and come up with a way of defining, what happens if you're landing a space rocket on an asteroid and you're trying to extract some minerals, and I've got my own space rocket. I'm landing on the other side of the same asteroid. Who owns it? Is it like a homesteading system? You were there first, or how does it work? How are we going to resolve that conflict? That's something which will have to be worked out. At the moment, up until this point, it was never necessary to even think about it.
Yeah. And also things like nuclear energy. Space exploration in the way in which we can create space-based nuclear energy. We could have literal energy abundance. Like, energy could cost basically nothing as a result of these advancements. These have real-life impact on people. This isn't just about people exploring space for the fun of it, so that we can think about those things. These technologies have real impact on real people, and fundamentally, this is about the world moving forward towards the future.
Yeah.
Well, that's a great way to end this podcast. Tom and Kristian, thank you so much for joining me today. And thank you to all of you for watching and listening. If you're interested in reading, exploring the space economy, check out the website iea.org.uk. And I would encourage all of you to become IEA Insider subscribers at insider.iea.org.uk.